The fight didn't begin with the bell, it began with numbers, and numbers can lie better than people ever admit. 14 wins, 14 knockouts. That was the weight Lenar Perez carried into the ring. A perfect record that followed him like a shadow, and spoke louder than his footsteps. To the crowd, those numbers promised violence, inevitability, the kind of night where someone would fall hard and early. But across the ring stood Aleksei Egorov, a man whose record told a quieter, heavier story. 12 wins, 2 losses, one of them in a world title fight where he learned exactly what elite pressure feels like when it refuses to let go. This was the real tension before the opening exchange. Perfection versus survival. Perez walked in calm, almost detached, the product of Cuban schooling where discipline is drilled deeper than aggression. Egorov walked in hardened, shoulders set, eyes already narrowed, knowing that knockouts fade, but endurance doesn't. When the first round opened, nothing exploded, and that alone was unsettling. Perez didn't rush to protect the myth of his power. Egorov didn't try to smother it recklessly. They circled, measured, and breathed. Both men understanding something the casual eye often misses. The opening rounds aren't about damage, they're about information. Perez tested range with the jab, light but purposeful, while Egorov edged forward inch by inch, gauging reactions rather than forcing moments. This was not fear, it was respect. Egorov knew power when he saw it, but he also knew power loses authority when it doesn't dictate tempo. Perez, for his part, looked physically imposing, chiseled and still, but he was conservative, almost restrained, as if waiting to see whether this veteran would respond like the others before him. The bell ended the first round without punctuation, but the message was already clear. This fight would not be fast, and it would not be simple. The second round deepened that realization. Perez began to loosen his shoulders, flicking the jab with more confidence, touching rather than detonating. Egorov kept his head moving, subtly rolling and stepping, denying the clean openings that make knockout artists look supernatural. Nothing dramatic landed, yet the tension grew heavier with every exchange that didn't end the fight. Somewhere between breaths, a question began to form, not in the ring, but in the arena itself. What happens if the knockout never comes? That question followed Perez as he returned to his corner, and it followed Egorov too, because he knew something dangerous was happening. The undefeated man was settling in, and when a fighter stops chasing the finish and starts embracing the rounds, the fight becomes something entirely different. By the third round, the contest shifted from cautious observation to subtle assertion. Egorov began doing what veterans do best, turning space into pressure, without throwing volume for the sake of it. He shortened the ring, stepping laterally instead of straight in, nudging Perez closer to the ropes where decisions must be made faster. Perez didn't panic. He leaned back, rolled his shoulders, used the ropes as a tool rather than a trap, slipping punches just enough to make Egorov reset. This was high-level boxing hidden in plain sight, the kind of work that doesn't show up in highlight reels but wins fights in judges' notebooks. The Cuban's jab began to snap with more authority now, occasionally followed by a right hand thrown with intent but not desperation. Egorov absorbed what landed, his chin unbothered, his body language unchanged, and that alone was its own form of resistance. This was the moment where knockout artists often reveal themselves. Either they grow impatient, or they grow incomplete. He stayed composed, his eyes sharp, his movements economical. But Egorov was learning too. He saw that Perez preferred distance, that his best work came when he could reset and fire clean. So he closed that distance deliberately, touching the body, bumping shoulders, making Perez carry weight, even when punches didn't land clean. The fourth round told a quiet story of accumulation. Egorov's pressure wasn't dramatic, but it was persistent, and persistence wears on rhythm. Perez responded not with brute force, but with variation. Jabs to the body, quick lead rights, subtle angles that kept Egorov honest. The undefeated record remained intact, but its invincibility had softened into something human. Both fighters showed signs of contact now, light swelling, reddened skin, visual proof that neither man was imposing absolute dominance. This was no longer about who hit harder, it was about who could maintain clarity, as fatigue crept in. Egorov, seasoned by hard nights, trusted that the later rounds would favor him. Perez trusted his fundamentals, confident that discipline would outlast desperation. And in that mutual trust, the fight found its identity. This wasn't a test of courage. Both men had that. It was a test of adaptability. Every time Egorov inched closer, Perez found just enough space. Every time Perez touched clean, Egorov answered with forward motion. The crowd sensed it too. Not a brawl, but a contest tightening with purpose. By the end of the fourth, it was clear that this fight would be decided not by a single moment, but by dozens of small ones, stacked patiently on top of each other. Rounds 5 and 6 marked the turning point, where subtle control began to matter more than raw intent. Egorov increased his output, sensing the midpoint as his opportunity to test Perez's durability beyond technique. He went to the body more, digging short shots, forcing exchanges instead of allowing resets. Perez answered with combinations, not heavy, but precise quick uppercuts, straight rights that found their way through the guard just often enough to discourage recklessness. This was the most competitive stretch of the fight, where neither man could afford to lose focus for even a second. Egorov's experience became visible in the way he absorbed punches without reacting emotionally. He didn't chase returns. He didn't overswing. He simply stayed present, convinced that constant pressure would eventually slow the younger man's feet. Perez, however, showed something just as valuable: maturity. Despite never having gone 10 rounds as a professional without stopping someone, he managed his energy intelligently. He didn't bite on feints. He didn't empty the tank chasing an ego-driven finish. Instead, he worked in measured bursts, stealing moments within the rounds, rather than trying to dominate them outright. This was where the undefeated record began to evolve into something more meaningful. Not because he was overwhelming Egorov, but because he was solving him. The 6th round in particular felt like a negotiation between styles. Egorov pressed harder, landing body shots that demanded acknowledgement. Perez responded with sharper counters, finding angles that momentarily froze the Russian's advance. The exchanges grew more frequent, the contact more audible. And still, neither man buckled. What emerged instead was a growing clarity. Perez was landing the cleaner shots, even when Egorov appeared busier. Clean punching doesn't always excite crowds, but it wins rounds. And by the halfway point, that distinction began to matter. As the bell ended the 6th, both men returned to their corners marked, but composed. This wasn't exhaustion, it was engagement. They were fully invested now, aware that the margin between victory and defeat had narrowed to details. For Perez, these rounds were teaching him that dominance doesn't require devastation. For Egorov, they reinforced the belief that persistence could still rewrite the script. The fight was balanced on a blade, and every step forward risked cutting deeper. The 7th and 8th rounds transformed the bout into a study of endurance, not physical alone, but mental. Egorov continued to push, trusting his durability and hoping to erode Perez's composure. He trapped him on the ropes more often now, forcing defensive responsibility instead of comfort. Perez, remarkably, looked at ease there. He slipped, rolled, and countered in tight spaces, turning what should have been danger into demonstration. This was Cuban boxing stripped of theater. Practical, efficient, unforgiving. Every clean counter chipped away at Egorov's momentum, even if it didn't visibly hurt him. The Russian remained relentless, but the rhythm increasingly favored the man doing less, but landing better. The 8th round felt decisive in tone, if not yet in outcome. Perez landed sequences that visibly moved Egorov, not with power, but with timing. Those moments told the judges something important: control. Still, Egorov never folded. He kept walking forward, shoulders squared, faith intact. That faith is what makes fighters like Egorov dangerous. Not belief in victory, but belief in effort. He believed that if he stayed close long enough, something would give. It never did. Perez's snap stayed sharp, his breathing steady, his defense intact. The war of attrition Egorov hoped for turned instead into a lesson in efficiency. By the end of the 8th, the story had quietly shifted. This was no longer about whether Perez could knock him out. It was about whether Egorov could take the fight away from him. and the answer increasingly appeared to be no. The final 2 rounds carried the weight of truth. Egorov, ever determined, emptied what he had left, pressing forward with urgency, trying to force exchanges that might finally break the stalemate. Perez stayed disciplined, touching with the jab, choosing his moments carefully, refusing to let emotions steal position. The 9th was Egorov's best late surge, hands flying, pressure rising. But even then, Perez's counters cut through the chaos. In the 10th, the reality settled in. The knockout was gone, but something greater had replaced it. Command. When the final bell rang, there was no collapse, no drama, only mutual acknowledgement. 10 rounds completed. 10 rounds survived. The decision confirmed what the fight had already revealed. Lenar Perez was no longer just an undefeated knockout artist. He was a complete fighter. The belt wrapped around his waist carried more weight than any previous stoppage, because it was earned through patience, adaptation, and composure under pressure. Egorov, in defeat, reinforced his own identity. The man who never folds, who forces fighters to grow or fail. This fight didn't end careers, it built one. For Perez, these 10 rounds were not a blemish on perfection, but the foundation of legitimacy. Power introduces you to boxing, but nights like this are what make you belong.